Greetings. Good Sabbath to all of you out there. Shabbat Shalom. This is being recorded, so after you listen to if you're American and you're listening to the press conference conducted by the president and others, after you finish with that, then you can hear this message. I happen to live in Central Florida. These messages are coming from Osceola County. Yesterday, in the late afternoon, we're thinking about the coming Sabbath. A policeman came to the door, and I was thinking, I haven't violated the recommendations of the government. I'm not having I haven't done anything wrong. Looking back at it now, did I have any kind of mass party or mass gathering or whatever? No. But that's not what the policeman came to talk about. He came to tell me, don't go into your backyard. There's a 6 to 7 foot alligator back there. Well, sure enough, there was that very impressive looking alligator back there in the backyard. Well, it went away eventually. We have a large pond nearby. I suppose that's where it hangs out. And there's a big sign by that pond. It says, watch out for the alligator. And sure enough, there, he came out of the pond, at least before the Sabbath. So I guess that's one of the exciting aspects of life in Florida. Now, if you want to see the gator, then watch the flare service next week. God willing, we'll have a service next week of the Flare Church, as we usually do, and normally it's Sabbath morning, and I'll try to show you some video of the alligator. Well, maybe that was one of the creatures, more than likely crocodile, that Solomon would have studied. Solomon was a student of the world. He wanted to know as much as he could know. He was a brilliant leader, very accomplished in so many fields, and probably not given proper credit. You hear all about the Phoenicians, and that's fine. We want to respect the Phoenicians, the ancient Lebanese, and how they spread knowledge of the alphabet. But, along with them were Hebrews, Israelites. Solomon and Hiram collaborated. So the alphabet spread by means of the Phoenicians, but also, would dare say, by means of the Israelites. Solomon was a great king. And today I want to talk about a critical lesson from a famous monarch. A critical lesson from a famous monarch, Shlomo HaMelech, King Solomon. Jews in America used to give their children biblical names, but names that didn't sound too Jewish, because of anti-Semitism. So my father's name was Samuel, but his Hebrew name was Shlomo, Solomon. My son, my firstborn, I have 4 children, and the third one was my first son, and then the fourth one, was our first, or the third one was our first son, fourth one was our second son, and I named my third son, my third child, our first son, Daniel Solomon, and the Solomon part was he's named for his grandfather, whom he would have never known because my father died when I was quite young. So Shlomo HaMelech, and Shlomo comes from peace. He had another name as well, but the name by which he's known pretty much is Shlomo, or coming from Shalom, peace, or Shalem, being whole, being complete. And he was a great king, the greatest king in some ways in the history of Israel. Well, perhaps you could say David was greater, in certainly in terms of his relationship to God. David sinned and repented and finished his life, let's say, as right with God. Unfortunately, Solomon didn't. But in Matthew 12:42, Jesus says, "The queen of the south will rise up in the judgment with this generation and condemn it. For she came from the ends of the earth to hear the wisdom of Solomon, and indeed a greater than Solomon is here." So we have the Queen of Sheba, who came, to visit Solomon, very famous in many circles. When I was a boy, I saw quite an epic movie about Solomon and Sheba. I have found out that recently, not, in the 1990s, a made-for-TV movie was done. I don't know if it was. I don't think it was as close to the Bible as the other. The other, wasn't entirely biblical either, but I think it was closer to the Bible than the more modern version, which I never got to see. But people are aware of Solomon and Sheba. Certainly, people are aware of wise King Solomon. And unfortunately, with all his wisdom, he didn't finish successfully from a spiritual point of view. Perhaps at the last moment he did, but perhaps it saved his reputation or his future, but he had already created so much havoc that he couldn't undo the harm he had done in terms of how it affected his country. I'd like to talk about the greatness of Solomon, and sometimes I think we, as I say, underrate him. There's a lot of the Bible that he's responsible for. If we go to 1 Kings 3, he's quite young when he takes power. He didn't live all that long. He kind of aged before some do, probably because of his lifestyle. If you read about how he lived. But in 1 Kings 3 and verse 11, he prayed for wisdom. He was young. He was going to be ruling God's people. His father was David, the great David, the ancestor of the Messiah, the human ancestor of Jesus Christ. The Davidic covenant was made with David, that the Messiah would come from David. David himself will be resurrected and rule under Christ. So here is his son Solomon, verse 11 of 1 Kings 3. Then God said to him, because you have asked this thing, and have not asked long life for yourself, nor have asked riches for yourself, nor have asked the life of your enemies, but have asked for yourself understanding to discern justice. Behold, I have done according to your words. See, I have given you a wise and understanding heart, so that there has not been anyone like you before you, nor shall any like you arise after you. And I have also given you what you have not asked, both riches and honor, so that there shall not be anyone like you among the kings all your days. But he also admonished him. Verse 14, so if you walk in my ways, to keep my statutes and my commandments, as your father David walked, then I will lengthen your days. Samuel warned God's people, you don't want a king. You don't want a king. And I come from the United States, where in the 18th century we had a cynic, but he was wise enough to quote the Bible in order to propagandize for a revolt against King George III. And he used material from 2 Samuel about what a king would do. And so anyway, I believe that Samuel put a section into the book of Deuteronomy, which we now have, and this represents rules for the king. If you're going to have a king, I'll pick the king, God says. He's got to come from your own people, and he's got to obey certain rules. And so in Deuteronomy 17:16, remember the Israelites had just come out of Egypt, and they were not to go back there. Egypt was not the proper place for them. It was too sinful of an environment. They needed to get out of there and go to a place where they could be in charge. God could be in charge over them. They could establish a theocracy. They could establish a government under the Sinaitic covenant. Now, don't go back to Egypt. So in Deuteronomy 17:16 it says, but he shall not multiply horses for himself, nor cause the people to return to Egypt to multiply horses, for the Eternal has said to you, you shall not return that way again. Now, perhaps Solomon felt like, well, it's been so long, we're in no danger now of going back to Egypt. So he got very involved with Egypt, and I think even including getting horses from there. Well, let's go on. It says, neither shall he multiply wives for himself. Deuteronomy 17:17. Neither shall he multiply wives for himself, lest his heart turn away, nor shall he greatly multiply silver and gold for himself. He somehow, I imagine he may have rationalized what he did by thinking, well, this is important for international affairs, for geopolitics, for the power of my empire. I'm not doing this just because I want a lot of wives and concubines. I'm doing this for the sake of the nation, for the sake of the influence and power of the nation. It's diplomacy. Maybe that's how he rationalized it. And as far as all the wealth coming to the capital, maybe he felt it was important to unify the country, to have a really beautiful capital. But people in the north felt like, hey, all this wealth is coming to Judah. What about us? And people were being conscripted to work and to build, but the work was going on, to embellish the capital, and in effect, the people in the north felt like they were being shortchanged. That created an issue later on. But we see that the warning was here in Deuteronomy, and elsewhere in the Bible, for that matter. If you want to argue about when this came in there, there's no, Solomon should have known better, because he was the wisest person that ever lived, so he should have known better. There's knowledge. You can gather data. There's understanding. You can see how the data relate to each other. And there's wisdom to know how to apply your understanding. However, in Solomon's case, he knew what to do and what not to do, but yet he somehow made excuses and did anyway what he shouldn't, and evidently did not do certain things he should have done. Even though he knew better, he was so wise. It is very sad, and as a result, he really messed up at the end of his reign. And so we do have, perhaps in his youth, he writes this beautiful love poetry. And so if you go to Song of Solomon, it's called by the Hebrew speakers Shir HaShirim, the Song of Songs. And so sometimes it's called Canticles. And I'm going now to Shir HaShirim. This is the book for this time of year. It's read by the Jews on the Sabbath during the days of unleavened bread. And in the King James, in most English Bibles, it's going to come before Isaiah. So I have problems with these different orders of books. But, okay, it'll come before Isaiah in this Bible. So in verse 1, the Song of Songs, which is Solomon's. And he's mentioned several times in the book. So people believe that the tradition is that he wrote this in his youth. Now, as he got older, with all the by the way, he had fleets that went out and traded with other countries. As I said, he worked together with the ancient Lebanese people, who are very, entrepreneurial type people, and travel around, and as Jews have done. And so he worked together with the Lebanese, ancient Lebanese people, and he had fleets that went here and there, and all around the world that was known at that time. And evidently, if scholars have studied the poetry of the Song of Solomon, and they find that it's similar to the poetry of the Tamil-speaking people that you find in South India and Sri Lanka, the Tamils. Anyway, I want to go now to Proverbs, and Proverbs, as I said, he had fleets going all around the world, and he had people visiting him from all around the world. So he collected a lot of data about a lot of different things. He also collected proverbs, wise sayings. He would have come up with some with God's inspiration, and also would have collected others. A lot of his material came from Egypt. Egypt was an ancient civilization even by that time, and scholars have seen a lot of parallels between Proverbs and wisdom literature from ancient Egypt. But we find here in Proverbs 1, again, it says here, the Proverbs of Solomon, the son of David, king of Israel. And then if you go to Proverbs 25, you'll find long after Solomon died, a collection was made of Proverbs during the time of Hezekiah. I want to go to Proverbs 25. These also are Proverbs of Solomon, which the men of Hezekiah, king of Judah, copied. Now I want to go to the 10th chapter of Proverbs, because I talked about Solomon's name, Shlomo, and I want to go to Proverbs 10 and verse 1. It says the Proverbs of Solomon, and then it gives one here, and then it gives altogether 375. And it ends with, in the 22nd chapter and the 16th verse, and then you have a different section. Verse 17 says, incline your ear and hear the words of the wise. But so you have Proverbs of Solomon that go from 10:1 to 22:16, 375 of them, which equals numerically the value of his name. Shin Lamed Mem He. 375 is the numerical value of his name. What we call gematria. So we have 375 proverbs in this section. But towards the end of his life, he realized the vanity of it all, of what he had done. And so we find in Ecclesiastes, we find Solomon as an old and embittered man. He had blown it. But I think that Ecclesiastes shows us that perhaps right near the end of his life, he finally did repent. But the damage had been done as far as what he had done to his kingdom. And so the nation was going to pay the price. The lesson was going to be learned. But here in Ecclesiastes, the words of the preacher, the son of David, king in Jerusalem, vanity of vanities, says the preacher, vanity of vanities, all is vanity. And you may recall that he had altogether 1,000 women, if you count the wives and concubines. And if the Bible model for marriage is one man, one woman for life, that is the biblical model. And polygamy will lead to not having a proper relationship with any of them. In other words, monogamy will produce the best relationship between a male and a female. And we have in Ecclesiastes 7:28 an interesting statement by Solomon. Ecclesiastes 7:28, which my soul, this is interesting, which my soul still seeks, but I cannot find. One man among 1,000 I have found, but a woman among all these I have not found. So with 1,000 women, he didn't have a really proper relationship with any one of them. This is also very important. And we find, of course, at the end of the book, it's all summarized here. I'll go to the 13th verse of Ecclesiastes 12. And the way their book is structured, this would, I could argue, for Solomonic authorship of this part as well. Let us hear this is Ecclesiastes 12:13. Let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is man's all. This is the whole man. Hizeh kol ha'adam. This is all of the man. And so Solomon learned that lesson finally. And so he could have died a righteous man, but in the meantime, the punishments had come. And I suppose that's what pushed him to finally repent, is when the punishments began to come. He began to see that how much damage he had caused. I want to go to 1 Kings, and his reign started out so successfully, and it was a kind of foreshadowing of the millennium. It was the best period in Israel's history. They had the greatest extent of their power. They had an alliance with the Lebanese to the north. They had sovereignty over areas, suzerainty. They had overall power over areas, all the way, of course, from the Euphrates into the Sinai area. The ideal boundaries of the land. Um, I will have to go back to First Kings, the fourth chapter, and talk a little bit about it. As I said, he started out so successfully. Verse 20 of 1 Kings 4. Judah and Israel were as numerous as the sand by the sea, in multitude eating and drinking and rejoicing. So Solomon reigned over all kingdoms from the river to that land of the Philistines as far as the border of Egypt. This brought tribute, and they brought tribute and served Solomon all the days of his life. And a lot is said about Solomon. Verse 25, and Judah and Israel dwelt safely, each man under his vine and his fig tree. It's like the millennium. From Dan as far as Beersheba, all the days of Solomon. Verse 29, and God gave Solomon wisdom and exceedingly great understanding and largeness of heart, like the sand on the seashore. Thus Solomon's wisdom excelled the wisdom of all the men of the East and all the wisdom of Egypt. But he did gather from those sources to put together the book of Proverbs. Verse 34, and men of all nations, from all the kings of the earth who had heard of his wisdom, came to hear the wisdom of Solomon. I think that we're going to find when when real history is uncovered, the impact that he had probably is understated by historians. And I'd like to look at the 10th chapter of this First Kings, and it talks about, as I said, the fleets that went out. Verse 22 of 1 Kings 10. For the king had merchant ships at sea with the fleet of Hiram. Once every that he was up there in Tyre and Sidon in that area. For the king had merchant ships at sea with the flight of Hiram. Once every 3 years the merchants came back bringing gold, silver, ivory, apes, and monkeys. So King Solomon surpassed all the kings of the earth in riches and wisdom. Now all the earth sought the presence of Solomon to hear his wisdom, which God had put in his heart. And it talks about, tribute coming to him. Verse 26, and Solomon gathered chariots and horsemen. I'm going to jump down a little bit farther. In verse 27, the king made silver as common in Jerusalem as stones, and he made cedar trees as abundant as the sycamores which are in the lowland. But a lot of the wealth was coming to the capital. But then, as I said, the people up north felt like they were being oppressed in order to benefit those who were around Jerusalem. Then also Solomon had horses imported from Egypt. I read to you from Deuteronomy. No, you don't do that, right? Also Solomon had horses imported from Egypt and Kevet. This is an area in what is today Turkey. The king's merchants brought them in Kevet at the current price. So you get an idea he overdid it. Let's put it that way. He overdid it. So we find that he was led astray by all this wealth and power and wisdom and adulation he was getting. And I understand it's hard when a person is that talented and is that much of a celebrity not to get what we might call a swell head and to think that you can somehow be an exception to the rule. I think that's true about many celebrities today. They think that they're somehow able to do things that the average person wouldn't allow him or herself to do. And it says, verse 11, but King Solomon loved many foreign women, as well as the daughter of Pharaoh, women of the Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, Sidonians, and Hittites, from the nations of whom the Eternal had said to the children of Israel, you shall not intermarry with them, nor they with you. Surely they would turn away your hearts after their gods. Solomon clung to these in love. So you see that it's not a matter of race. It's a matter of spirituality. These were pagan peoples, idolatrous peoples. They engaged, their way of life was hostile to the values of God's word, and so God's people were not to intermarry with them, so that they wouldn't be led astray into idolatry. But unfortunately, he decided that he could do that. As I said, he was forging alliances this way. That's not how you do it. Verse 3, and he had 700 wives, princesses, and 300 concubines. As I said, 1,000 women, and his wives turned away his heart. So anyway, we see what happened here, and I can go on, but let's notice that he even aided them and abetted their idolatry. Now I want to tell you, for many years, for many summers, I had the opportunity to teach very delightful young ladies from Japan, and I could see where a very powerful person might marry a woman from a culture very alien to his own, and she's a very delightful young lady, and he might think, well, I want to keep her happy, and instead of trying to work with her to get rid of that, to come into a relationship to God, as Ruth did, rather to in effect compromise. So it wasn't that these women were necessarily all malicious women. It's possible some of them were, but some of them may have been very delightful people, but they didn't know any better. But he did, and yet he compromised and he enabled their practices. I'm in verse 7. Then Solomon built a high place for Chemosh, the abomination of Moab, on the hill that is east of Jerusalem, and for Molech, the abomination of the people of Ammon. And he did likewise for all the foreign wives who burned incense and sacrificed to their gods. Verse 9. So the Eternal became angry with Solomon, because his heart had turned from the eternal God of Israel, who had appeared to him twice. And so we find that there were hostile forces that gradually became more powerful towards the end of his reign, evidently. He had opposition up in Syria, opposition in the southern part of what is today Jordan, and it became more of a problem as his reign ended. So it became something that the future Israelites would have to deal with, threats from Syria and from what is today Jordan. Some things don't change. But anyway, another very serious problem was the fact that he had an opponent who wanted to be king of Israel, and that was Jeroboam. And I want to show you how a prophet appeared to Jeroboam and told him that he would indeed inherit the kingdom, but God intended to preserve the Davidic line. He intended to preserve this, some semblance of the monarchy he had established through David. So he didn't give all of Israel to Jeroboam, and so Israel split between Israel and Judah. Now it's interesting. A great Bible scholar, whom I greatly admire, often said that God, when God divided the kingdom of Israel and Judah, he did so in effect to preserve the Torah, because the people in the south, Judah, where you had the Davidic monarchy and the Levitical priesthood, and the sons of Aaron, the sons of Levi, and the sons of David, the people of Judah retained a commitment to the old covenant. The northern tribes more or less gave it up, and had the nation stayed together, the whole nation might have apostatized in that way. But dividing it up preserved Judah to the south, and to this very day, the Jews have retained their identity as the descendants of the ancient Israelites, and many of them, as far as they understand, try to be as faithful as they can to the Sinaitic covenant. Now, obviously, there's issues there that have to be dealt with, but yet, after all these centuries, as I said, the Jews have retained their identity as Israel, whereas the northern tribes, they're the lost tribes. So in one sense, when God did this, he was punishing Solomon, but he also was preserving the church. Well, anyway, I won't go into all the details, but the prophet Ahijah revealed to Jeroboam that he would inherit most of the kingdom, but he told him he needed to be righteous. And unfortunately, he wasn't. He led his nation right away into apostasy, and so eventually that nation disappeared. The southern kingdom did survive, but but the kingdom wouldn't have split. There wouldn't have been this problem of corruption of the nation if Solomon hadn't become corrupted. There's one saying I learned from a talk show host in Southern California, a very wonderful man. Of course, he's been dead many years, but he lived a long life. His name was George Putnam, and he used to say, "The fish stinks at the head." And so, unfortunately, Solomon became corrupt. It corrupted the nation, and so the nation split after his death. And so we had the separate kingdoms of Israel and Judah, sometimes at peace, sometimes in conflict, and then the disappearance of the southern kingdom. So Solomon did learn a very bitter lesson, that he was not an exception to the rule. That it wasn't enough to know what you had to do. You had to actually do it. Wisdom is not enough if we don't actually live according to the wisdom that we have. And this is really the critical lesson that we can learn from this great monarch, Solomon. A critical lesson from a famous monarch, that it's not enough to know. We need to do what we know. We need to live what we know. We need to actually not only have the knowledge, but carry it out. And I want to go to Romans, the 2nd chapter, because that pretty much summarizes my point. Now, there's a lot I could have covered, obviously. I heard a sermon on this subject from a friend of mine also who's not alive anymore, an elder minister who used to be head of the transportation department in the college where I used to work in Northeast Texas. He gave a sermon on this subject in Sherman, Texas, many years ago, and it took more time than I'm taking. But I want to go to Romans, the 2nd chapter. Romans, the 2nd chapter, and in verse 13. Romans 2 and verse 13. Now, I happen to be speaking to an audience. Now, I hope and pray that God will use this ministry to reach, over the years, many, many people. The videos are there. Someday others will discover them, perhaps. Large numbers will discover them, perhaps. Or others will find them who themselves can influence large numbers of others. One way or the other, I'm trying to keep the truth alive, as one of our leaders used to say, keep the faith and spread it. There is a lesson that we can learn. But the point I'm bringing out is that, yes, someday maybe a lot of people will hear this message who don't know a lot about the Bible. But right now my audience is smaller, and I have people who are biblically literate. Those of you who are listening to me know the Bible, and that's great. But all of us have to realize we have to act on what we know. We have to put into practice what we understand. And that is, Solomon evidently didn't sufficiently do that, and it cost him dearly, cost his people dearly. So that is a critical lesson, that we need to act on what we know. Romans 2 and verse 13. For not the hearers of the law are just in the sight of God, but the doers of the law will be justified. So we need to know what's in God's word, and then we need to live according to what we know and understand. A critical lesson from a famous monarch. All the best to you and yours.